The gown did not fit her. That was the first thing Cecily noticed, standing in the gray pre-dawn of the prison corridor while the Duchess's maid drew the laces as tight as they would go. The bodice was cut for a woman of 50 with a lifetime of dignity settled into her frame, and Cecily was 23 and slight, and the fabric gaped at the shoulder and pooled at the hem where the Duchess was taller by 2 inches. It did not matter. No one would be looking at the gown. The morning of the 22nd of March was cold, in the particular way that London in early spring could be cold. Not winter's honest bite, but something meaner. A damp gray chill that found its way beneath wool and settled in the chest. The courtyard of Newgate Prison held perhaps 200 souls by the time the outer doors opened, and the sound of them was a low, continuous murmur, the sound of people who had come to witness something they would discuss for the rest of their lives. Cecily heard it through the stone walls. She heard it the way a woman hears rain on a roof. In a house she has not yet decided whether to call home. She did not hurry. She smoothed the ill-fitting gown once with both hands, straightened what could be straightened, and pressed her palm briefly to the pocket where her father's copy of the Psalms rested against her hip. The leather was warm from her hand. It was always warm. She had carried it every day since his death. She was frightened. That is the honest account of it. She was frightened in a way that lived not in her mind, but in her body, a cold trembling below the ribs, a throat that kept tightening against no visible cause, a pulse she could feel in her wrists and her temples, and the shallow curve of her collarbone. She was also perfectly calm. These two things were not contradictory. She had learned that from her father, who had been frightened the morning they came for him, and calm as well, standing in the doorway of the parsonage, with his hands at his sides and no apology in his face. He had sheltered a man because it was the right thing to do. He had accepted the consequences because they were the right thing to accept. He had not survived them. She had not meant to love him quite so much that she would carry his lesson here, to this courtyard, in a gown that did not fit. But here she was, and the guard was at the door, and there was nothing left to do but walk through it. 4 days earlier, the drawing-rooms of Mayfair had been abuzz with the arrest of Dorothea, Duchess of Keswick, on a charge of high treason. The word moved through the season like a stone through still water, each ripple more distorted than the last. By the time it reached the furthest edges of the morning calls, the Duchess had been convicted in the court of public opinion before she had faced any court at all. The drawing-rooms agreed, with the particular confidence of people who had never loved anyone difficult, that she had always been eccentric, that her political associations had long been suspect, and that the business with the foreigner she had apparently harbored in the East Wing of Keswick House was entirely in keeping with her character. The drawing-rooms were not cruel, they were simply certain, and certainty in those rooms had always felt identical to cruelty. Cecily had been the Duchess's companion for 4 years. She had come to Keswick House at 19, the orphaned daughter of a Shropshire clergyman, with excellent French, a thorough knowledge of household management, and nothing else. The Duchess had hired her without condescension, and had treated her, across those 4 years, with a kind of brisk, unsentimental regard that was the closest thing to genuine affection Cecily had encountered since her father's death. She was not, under any ordinary understanding of the word, necessary to the Duchess. She was a companion. She was useful. She knew her station precisely. She had been present at a small dinner at Lord Alderton's house 2 evenings before the arrest, seated in the unremarkable position that companions occupied at such tables, present but not addressed, visible but not seen. Lady Henrietta Marsh, seated 3 chairs to the left in a gown of pale gold that cost more than Cecily's annual salary, had leaned toward her own dinner partner and said, in the particular tone designed to carry, "She is only the companion after all. No one of account." She had been speaking of Cecily directly. She had not lowered her voice. She had looked at Cecily once, as one looks at furniture assessing for damage. Cecily had said nothing. She had lifted her water glass and set it down. The arrest came the following morning. Cecily had been in the library when the officers arrived, 3 of them in their official coats, carrying the kind of papers that do not require a signature, only a signature's absence. She had stood at the doorway and watched Dorothea face them. Upright and expressionless, in a morning gown and a shawl she had not had time to exchange for her outdoor things, and she had seen in the Duchess's face something that was not quite fear, something more specific than fear, grief. The particular grief of a person who has been protecting something for a very long time and has just watched the protection fail. Cecily was permitted to visit the cell that afternoon. The law allowed a companion certain small courtesies, and the guard had looked at her with something between indifference and sympathy and stepped aside. She brought a lamp and her writing things and the Duchess's lacework, which Dorothea would never actually do in the cell, but which seemed important to bring. Dorothea was sitting in the cell's single chair, very straight, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at Cecily when she entered, and said nothing for a long moment. The silence was not uncomfortable. Precisely. Mayor, Wills. It was the silence of two people who have spent 4 years in close quarters and have learned which silences require words and which do not. Then she said, "You should not have come." "I wanted to," Cecily said. "There is nothing you can do." "I know!" Cecily sat on the bench opposite and set the lamp between them so the light reached both their faces. "Tell me what they have said." What they had said was this. A man named Anton Vreeland had been found in the east wing of Keswick House in January, carrying documents of a sensitive military nature. He had been arrested. He had refused to explain himself, refused to name anyone, and had subsequently died in custody of a fever that the official record called natural. The documents had been traced to a contact within the Crown's own network. Dorothea had sheltered him. She had known who he was. She had provided him rooms for 6 weeks, had fed him at her own table on the evenings when the household staff were away, had purchased warm clothes for him from a shop in the city under a name that was not her own. The charge of treason by association had been drawn up efficiently and precisely, and the trial had lasted 4 days, and the verdict had been certain from the first morning. Cecily listened to all of this without interrupting. She had a habit of listening with her whole attention, which people sometimes mistook for passivity, and which was, in fact, the opposite. She was recording. She was measuring. When Dorothea finished, she said, very quietly, "Who was he?" Dorothea did not answer immediately. The silence lasted long enough that Cecily thought she would not answer at all, that the answer was the one thing she had decided to take with her and would not be persuaded to put down. Then the Duchess looked at the lamp, and something in her face shifted, as if the light itself had reminded her that there were people who could carry a thing after she was gone. "My son," she said. Cecily held very still. "My son, by a man I was not married to in the winter before my marriage to the Duke. He was given to a Dutch family. He was always in some difficulty. He wrote to me 3 years ago. I had not seen him since he was 3 days old." She paused, and in the pause was everything that 30 years of silence contains. He was not a spy. He was a man who carried things for money, because he had no other means. He did not know what was in the documents. He told me, so I believed him. I have no proof of it now, because he is dead, and I burned his letters when the officers came, which was the action of a frightened woman, and which I regret. She looked at her hands. I could not let them take him and say nothing. I could not say nothing. And yet the moment I said anything, he became my agent, and I became his accomplice in something I did not understand. You sheltered him because he was your son, Cecily said. Yes. And you will not say so at the trial because it would destroy his name, and he is dead now, and his name is the only thing left of him. Dorothea looked at her. There was nothing theatrical in her expression. There was simply recognition. The recognition of being seen accurately by another person, which is one of the rarest and most relieving things that can happen to a person in a prison cell. Yes, she said. Cecily rode back to Keswick House in the carriage with the Duchess's maid, who had wept the entire way. She had gone directly to the library and sat for 1 hour without lighting the lamp. She had held her father's Psalms book in both hands in the dark. Why? She had run her thumb along the repaired spine, feeling the twine her father had used when the binding split. The careful, patient knot he had tied with the same hands he used for everything. The hands she still sometimes looked for in rooms he had never been inside. She had thought about her father, who had sheltered a man because the man was frightened and cold, and came to the parsonage door in November, asking for bread and a dry night. The man had turned out to be a debtor fleeing a creditor who had paid constables to pursue him across 3 counties. The constables had come to the parsonage. Her father had said the man was a traveler who had already gone on, which was untrue, because the man was in the barn beneath the winter hay. Her father had been fined and formally censured by the church council, and had died 18 months later of an illness the local doctor attributed to the winter, and that Cecily attributed, in the wordless logic of grief, to the weight of being disgraced by people he had respected. He had lost his living. He had lost his standing. He had lost in some slow, essential way his understanding of himself as a man the world held in regard, and that loss had been, she believed, the illness the doctor could not see. She had never been angry about it. She had understood it the way you understand a theorem, with the mind. Fully accepting a truth the heart finds incomprehensible. He had done what was right. The world had done what the world does. The 2 things were not reconcilable, and only one of them was the wrong thing to do. She had held the book in the dark for 1 hour and known, without deciding it in any conscious way she could name, what she intended to do. She had not been able to put it into words that evening. She was not sure she could put it into words now. It was not a decision in the ordinary sense of that word, where a person weighs one thing against another and chooses the heavier side. It was more like a recognition. The recognition that her father's lesson had been building inside her for 5 years. And this was the moment it had been building toward. And to refuse it would be to refuse him, which she was not willing to do. She had worked out the practical details with the Duchess's maid before midnight. The gown, the timing, the guard who owed a debt to a person in the household, a debt that could be discharged with discretion, and a sealed letter and a figure she had saved from 4 years of wages. The morning of the execution, before the warden made his first visit. Before anyone looked too closely. Wah! The maid had wept through every instruction, and Cecily had held her hand once briefly, and then let go, because tenderness, without a clear task, can become its own obstruction. She had not told him. She had not known Edmund Hartwell was in London until the 2nd evening after the arrest, when he appeared in Newgate in the visiting hour, with a face like carved flint and eyes the color of smoke in winter light. He was the Duchess's cousin, the nearest male relation, arrived from Brussels, where he had been engaged in diplomatic business involving the remnant courts of the post-Napoleonic arrangement. He was 34, tall, broad, through the shoulder, with dark hair that had begun to show silver at the temple, and a jaw set in an expression of such disciplined containment that it looked as if it had been fixed that way by long practice and would require a significant event to unfix. He had not been looking at Cecily when he entered the corridor. He had been looking through the grating at the Duchess, who sat in her chair in the lamplight, and did not acknowledge him. Cecily was on the bench outside the cell, with her writing things, copying out a letter for the Duchess to sign, and she was aware of him, the way you are aware of any large still presence in a small space, as a change in the quality of the air. She had looked up when he did not pass her. He was watching her. Not with the politely dismissing gaze that men of his rank typically applied to companions, the swift assessment and dismissal that was as automatic as breathing, but with something more attentive than that, a quality of concentration she had not expected and could not quite account for. "My lord," she said, "you are the Earl of Ashmore." "I am." He held her gaze another moment. "You are the companion." "I am. Miss Cecily Vane." He nodded once and turned toward the grating. He spoke with Dorothea through the bars, his voice low and level, covering the ground of lawyers and petitions and appeals that all 3 of them understood would not succeed. He spoke without false comfort, which Cecily found she respected. False comfort in a prison cell is an insult wearing a pleasant expression. And yet, in the hour that followed, while he talked with Dorothea about procedural measures and the limits of what could still be done, she had noticed that he was aware of her presence in the corridor, the way you are aware of a lamp burning in a dark room, not looking at it directly but tracking its light with the body's involuntary attention. When she rose to trim the wick, he paused mid-sentence. When she sat again, he continued. She was not sure he knew he was doing it. She told him her plan the following morning, in the corridor outside the Keswick house. Morning room. She told him because she needed his assistance in one specific and limited capacity. She needed him to delay the maid's report of the substitution for 2 hours after the execution time, long enough for the machinery to have proceeded. Long enough that a simple rearrest of Dorothea and a resumption of the proceedings could not be the solution. He had stood in the corridor with his hat in his hand, and his face in that concentrated stillness, and the stillness had a quality of weight she could feel even at 3 feet's distance. When she finished, he said, "You are not going to do this." "I have already decided to do this," she said. "Miss Vane." His voice was very low. "What you are describing is a capital offense. The substitution itself is a crime against the Crown. They may simply try you alongside her." "I know. You will hang in her place, or alongside her. The outcome for you is the same either way." "I know." He looked at her with an expression she could not read entirely, somewhere between fury and something that was not quite its opposite, but inhabited similar territory. Then he said, "Why?" She had told him about her father. Not all of it, not the full weight of 5 years, but enough. The clergyman. The man at the door in November. The constables. The censure and the fine, and the 18 months. She had told him about the Psalms book, which she had held up briefly in the corridor light so he could see it. A small worn thing with the spine split and mended with twine, the leather polished dark from years of handling. "He did what was right," she said, and no one stood up and said so. "I've thought about that for 5 years. I have thought about what it would have meant if one person had stood in front of those constables and said, 'This man did what was right, and I will say so.' Just one person, one voice." She looked at him without looking away. "Dorothea sheltered her son because he was her son, and she is going to die for it. And in 50 years, no one will know the difference. I will not be the world that stayed silent." He had said nothing for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "I need 2 days." "You have one," she said. "The execution is set for the morning of the 22nd. She left him in the corridor. She did not know what he intended, and she had not asked. Because the plan did not depend on what he intended. It depended only on the maid, and the guard, and the gown that did not quite fit, and on Cecily herself, which was the only element she had ever been fully confident of. She had gone back to the prison that evening, with the maid and the Duchess's things, and she had done what needed to be done. He rode hard on the morning of the 21st, which was the day before the execution and the day Cecily had already traded places. He rode for a house in Southwark, where Mrs. Hambia Partlow, the former Keswick House housekeeper, had retired on a pension and a silence she had maintained for 30 years. She knew about the boy. She had known about him since before he had a name. She had been in service to the Duchess when the boy was born, and she had been the one to wrap him in blankets and carry him to the door in the dark, early morning of a January that looked very much like this one. And she had never in 30 years told anyone, because the Duchess had asked her not to, and because loyalty was, Partlow, not a sentiment but a practice. Edmund found her in her garden, planting something early in the cold soil. He had dismounted and stood at the gate and looked at her without preamble. "She has a companion," he said. "A young woman named Miss Vane. She traded places with the Duchess yesterday morning. She will walk to the scaffold tomorrow in the Duchess's name." Mrs. Partlow had straightened, slowly. She had set down her garden tools. "The only thing that will stop it," he said, "is the truth of who the man was. If Anton Vreeland was the Duchess's son, and the Duchess sheltered him on that ground, The treason charge is void. It becomes a maternal act, not a political one. There is precedent in a case from 1812 before. Lord Harrington. I have been researching it since the trial concluded. The difficulty is that the Duchess will not say it herself because she is protecting the boy's name. He looked at her. You were there when he was born. You are the only witness still living. I need you to come to Lord Calloway's house tonight and say what you know. Mrs. Partlow said nothing. She looked at the half-turned earth at her feet. She looked at the garden wall, which was stone, and very old, and had heard many things said in front of it, and kept them all. He had taken a breath. He had not intended to say the next thing. He had carried it for 3 years in the way you carry something you have decided is yours to carry and no one else's. And he had no particular plan to put it down in a garden, in Southwark, in front of a woman he had never met. It came out because the plan had run out. My wife died, he said, while I was away on Crown business. She went into labor 3 weeks early, and by the time the courier reached me in Vienna and I rode back, she had been gone for 11 days. I did not say goodbye to her. I did not hold her hand. I arrived, and the house was quiet, and the footman told me at the door, and that was all. He did not look away from Mrs. Partlow. I have spent 3 years arriving too late. To everything. To the trial. To the cell. To every conversation that might have made a difference. I arrived too late, and now there is a young woman in a cell who walked there in a gown that was not her own, for reasons that have nothing to do with me, and I am asking you to be the thing I cannot be in this particular moment. He stopped. His voice had not broken. It had not changed from its usual register level and low, but something behind it had shifted, some quality of containment that he normally maintained without effort. I am asking you to be the person who arrived in time. Mrs. Partlow looked at him for a long, silent moment. She looked at the garden. She looked at her hands, which were still holding the earth she had been pressing around the early shoots. He had her eyes, she said at last. The boy. He had her eyes, exactly the same shape, the same particular gray. I noticed it the moment they brought him to me, and I have never been able to stop seeing it. He was riding for Lord Calloway's house within the quarter hour. Cecily did not know any of this. She knew only the gray morning and the gown that did not fit, and the sound of the crowd coming through the stone walls, 200 souls who had come to witness something and were about to witness something else entirely. Lord Lisle met her at the prison gate. He was a man of 58, precise and thin and certain, with the manner of someone who had spent 40 years inside the machinery of law and had long since ceased to distinguish between the machinery and justice. He looked at her when the guard opened the gate, and he looked at the gown that gaped at the shoulder, and he said, "Where is the Duchess of Keswick?" "I am here in the Duchess's stead," Cecily said. "She is unwell and unable to stand the mourning." Lord Lisle looked at her with the professional attention of a man who has heard every possible category of lie and has developed a taxonomy for them. "You are not the Duchess," he said. "No." "Who are you?" "Miss Cecily Vane. I have been companion to the Duchess of Keswick for 4 years. Something moved across his face. Not contempt, not cruelty. Something more like the expression a well-built mechanism produces when an unexpected item has been placed in its workings. "The companion," he said. He said it the way you say a thing whose category you are already looking past. This changes nothing. The law does not negotiate with companions. The sentence stands against the person named in its terms, and the person named in its terms is in this courtyard, or she is not, and you are not her. He looked at the guards. The substitution is itself an offense, which we will address in due course. Proceed. She had known he would say something like this. She had not expected it to land quite so heavily in her chest. She held the Psalms book in her pocket and walked forward. The courtyard was larger than she had imagined, or perhaps it was the crowd that made it feel large. 200 faces arranged in the particular configuration of public witness, The faces near the front press of those who had arrived early enough to be at the front. The faces behind less distinct. A bank of attention that she felt on her skin rather than saw. She did not look at the faces. She looked at the stone of the far wall, which was gray and old and indifferent, and she thought about her father standing in the parsonage doorway, and she thought about Dorothea folding her hands in her lap in the cell chair, and she thought about the Psalms book's weight in her pocket, which was slight but present, which was all that was necessary. She had reached the steps when she heard the shift in the crowd. She had expected many sounds, the procedural machinery, the calling of a name, the particular shuffling sound crowds make when something begins. What she had not expected was the sound of a crowd ceasing to shuffle, going still all at once the way a body of water goes still when a stone drops into the center and the ripples travel outward. She stopped. She did not know why she stopped. Her body had made the decision before her mind had processed the cause. Behind her, at the edge of her hearing, a clerk was reading from a document in the flat tone of official proceeding. The woman in question claims to be one Miss Vane, companion to the Duchess of Keswick, a companion and nothing more, without standing in this proceeding too. The voice stopped. He was crossing the courtyard. He walked at the pace of a man who has decided something and is carrying that decision forward into the space in front of him, not hurrying because hurrying would suggest the outcome was uncertain. His boots were muddy from the ride. His coat was dark with the morning cold. He had no hat. He looked at Cecily with the same gray-blue eyes she had noticed through the prison grating, only now there was nothing of the watchful stillness in them. There was only direction. Lord Lisle stepped forward. "My Lord Ashmore, this proceeding is lawfully constituted, and I must ask." "I have a stay from Lord Calloway," Edmund said. His voice carried without effort in the cold air. "It is in his clerk's hands at the gate behind me." He did not look at Lord Lisle. He looked at Cecily, and he crossed the remaining distance, and he stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. She was aware of her pulse, audible and rapid, and the cold air on her face, and the crowd at her back, and the gown that gaped at the shoulder, and none of it felt as real as his face, which was looking at her with such specific, concentrated attention that everything else in the courtyard receded slightly. The way a fire makes the room around it smaller by making itself larger, he said, "This woman is my betrothed. You will release her now." The silence that followed occupied perhaps 4 seconds. It occupied 4 seconds the way a stone occupies the center of water. Lord Lisle began. "My lord, I must." "The stay of execution is in Lord Calloway's hand," Edmund said, and his voice had not changed, not raised, not sharpened. "Who is standing at the courtyard gate? Lord Calloway." Lord Calloway, the Lord Chief Justice, 71 years old, and the most senior judicial authority present in any room he entered, came through the crowd with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who has never in his life been required to hurry. He looked at the proceeding. He looked at Lord Lisle. He said with the simple authority of someone who has been deciding things for 50 years and has no particular interest in drama, "Stay the proceeding." Lord Lisle's certainty, which had held firm through every exchange of the morning, wavered. Mrs. Trentty Partlow came through the gate behind Lord Calloway, small and straight, in her black coat and gloves, moving through the parted crowd with the particular authority of a woman who has decided to say something and has stopped being afraid of the saying. She walked to the open center of the courtyard and stood there in the cold gray light, and said, in a voice that carried entirely without effort, as voices do when the speaker has been keeping something for 30 years and is finally setting it down, "I was in service to the Duchess of Keswick in the year of 1802. I was present at the birth of a son who was later given to a Dutch family by arrangement. The child was called Anton. I carried him from the room myself. His mother was the woman you have charged with treason. I have been silent about this for 30 years at her request. I am no longer silent." The crowd did not murmur. It did something more unusual, which was to listen, with the particular stillness of people who have come to witness one thing, and are being shown another entirely. Lord Lisle looked at Mrs. Partlow for a long moment. He looked at the documentation his clerk was holding. He looked at Lord Calloway, who returned his gaze with the mild patience of a man who has already read the relevant precedent and is waiting for the room to catch up. "The documentation," Lord Lisle said at last. "This would need to be properly documented and reviewed before." "Yes," Lord Calloway said. "Which is why we are going inside." He looked at the crowd with the benign authority of a man utterly accustomed to crowds obeying him. "The proceeding is stayed. This matter will be reviewed in the proper manner." Lady Henrietta Marsh had been standing at the edge of the crowd in her pale gold coat. Cecily did not know when she had arrived. She noticed her now, with that specific quality of social attention she had developed from years of watching rooms that did not acknowledge her presence. She watched Lady Henrietta look at Edmund. She watched her watch his face, and then watch where his face was pointing, and do the arithmetic with the swift efficiency of a woman who has spent her adult life calculating these particular sums. She watched her step back very quietly, and turn and move through the crowd, and the crowd closed behind her, and she was gone. The review of the case required 11 days. Mrs. Partlow's testimony was received in full and under oath. A Dutch record of adoption, located through the diplomatic channels Edmund used with the same methodical efficiency he apparently applied to everything he undertook, confirmed the boy's birth name and the family to whom he had been given. The precedent Edmund had found a case from 1812 before Lord Harrington involving a mother's concealment of a son engaged in border smuggling, was reviewed by Lord Calloway's chambers and found applicable on the essential point. The act of sheltering required a criminal intent, and a mother concealing a child's whereabouts from legal authority was a different category of act than a political agent concealing a spy's operation from the Crown. The treason charge was dismissed on the 12th day. The charge of sheltering a suspected person was acknowledged, reviewed, and determined insufficient to continue. Lord Lisle wrote the Duchess a letter. It was brief and formal and precise. It was not a groveling letter. He was not a man given to groveling, and Cecily would not have respected him more for it if he had been. It named what had been incorrectly assumed. It used the word regret twice in the final paragraph. She thought, reading it over the Duchess's shoulder, that for a man whose entire self had been built from procedural certainty, those 2 instances of the word regret were a considerable concession. Dorothea received it sitting in the morning room of Keswick House, in her own chair, in a gown that fit her correctly, with the morning light coming through the windows she had not expected to see again. She read it once and set it down beside her tea. "You were very calm," she said without looking up. "They tell me you were calm walking across the courtyard." "I was frightened," Cecily said. "I know. I mean that you were calm as well." She looked at the window. "He intends to call on you, Edmund. He told me so this morning, which means he has been sitting with the intention for at least several days, and has only just decided to say it aloud. He takes longer than most people to arrive at a thing. He is thorough." "He has not said so directly," Cecily said. "He will," Dorothea said, with the dry specific certainty of a woman who has known Edmund Hartwell since he was a boy in short coats, asking careful questions at dinner tables. "He is organizing his thoughts. He regards thoroughness as courtesy, which is, I have decided after considerable time, a form of consideration rather than a defect." She found him in the Keswick garden that afternoon, standing near the stone bench at the end of the kitchen path with his coat on and no hat, because she had come to understand that he rarely wore a hat when he was thinking. He heard her footsteps on the gravel and turned. "Miss Vane," he said. "My lord." He walked toward her. He stopped at the proper distance, which, in a garden in late March, with no one else present, was close enough that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver at his temples, the careful composure of a face that had been keeping something behind it for several days and was not entirely sure it intended to continue. She said, "You found Mrs. Partlow." "I did." "And Lord Calloway." He was in his study at 7 in the morning and was not pleased to receive a document requiring his immediate attention. He reviewed it nonetheless. A pause. He is a thorough man. It seems to be valued in your acquaintance. He looked at her. She thought the edge of something moved in his face, something that was in the same family as warmth, or perhaps the same family as a smile, though she was not certain she had seen him smile yet, fully and without reservation. He said, "Why did you not tell me the night before what you intended?" Not the plan itself, the timing. She had thought about the honest answer to this. "Because I thought you would try to stop me," she said. "And I did not have an argument that would satisfy you. You would have wanted more time. You would have wanted documentation, and legal precedent, and a viable alternative before you conceded the necessity of what I intended. I found those things," he said, "in one day," she said, "which was exactly what I did not believe was possible." She looked at him. "I was wrong about that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Cecily." He said it the way a person says a word. "They have been carrying for some days and have decided to put down in a specific place, not letting it fall, but setting it down with intention. Just her name, her given name with no title in front of it and nothing attached to it afterward. Only the stillness of the garden around them and the particular silence of late March when the earth is beginning to turn." She let the silence stand. He put out his hand gloved, at the formal distance the season required even in private gardens, and she took it. She felt his fingers close around hers with a steadiness that reminded her, in some way she could not entirely name, of the way her father used to hold her hand at the edge of a cold morning before church, as if steadiness were itself a form of shelter. She said, "You told her something, Mrs. Partlow." Something that broke the silence. "Yes. What did you tell her?" He looked at her hand in his. He did not answer immediately, and she had learned enough of him by now to know that the pause was not evasion, but the opposite. The careful assembling of something true. "I told her about my wife," he said. "That she died while I was in Vienna, that I did not come home in time." He paused again. "I told her that I have been arriving too late to everything since then, that I was asking her to be what I could not be in that particular hour." Cecily held his hand and looked at him, and did not say anything, because the thing he had told her did not require comment, only the acknowledgement of having been heard, and she was capable of providing that with her attention if not with words. He said, "You were not too late." He looked at her. "No," he said. "This time, I was not." That evening, she sat in the small library at Keswick House, with the lamp lit and the fire burning in the grate, and her father's Psalms book open on her knee. It was the room the Duchess used for correspondence. 2 chairs near the fire, and a window looking onto the garden, now going quietly dark, the last of the March light softening the stone wall and the first of the garden's early green. Edmund had stayed for dinner at the Duchess's insistence, and he had stayed after dinner without any particular insistence required, and he was now in the other chair with a cup of tea growing cold at his elbow and his long legs extended toward the fire, in an attitude that suggested he had no particular intention of being anywhere else this evening. She read aloud from the Psalms, not performing it, only following her father's habit of letting words fill a room in the evening. When silence had been full enough for long enough, her voice was not raised. The lamp burned steadily. The fire settled once, softly, and gave off a small cascade of warmth. She read to the end of the page. He did not speak. He did not need to. The chair opposite held him, warm and still, and present a person who had arrived in time and intended, she believed, to stay. She turned the page. Outside the garden lay in the early spring dark. Somewhere beyond the window, London went on being London, all its machinery and its verdicts and its crowds. Entirely unaware that in a library in Mayfair, a woman who had walked calmly to the scaffold was reading aloud from a small worn book with a repaired spine in a warm room beside a fire, with a man who had ridden through the night for her sake and did not appear to consider it worthy of particular remark. The page turned, the fire burned. It was enough. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If Cecily's quiet courage moved you, I would be glad to know your thoughts in the comments below.